Hello and welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name's James Copley and today we're going to be previewing the Sunderland-Watford game at the Stadium of Light. I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Bodell from the Watford Buzz podcast. Tom, welcome along and how are you getting on today?
Thanks, James. Yeah, really good, thank you. Just kind of getting over the disappointment of the end of Watford's transfer window, but we'll get to that.
Yes, absolutely right. Let's jump straight into it. So Watford, 1 win and 5, 3 losses on the spin. I've noticed a little bit of pressure building on Tom Cleverley. I had a little look at the table actually coming into the game, and Watford are obviously miles away from the relegation places and 3 points off the playoffs. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? The perspective of a football club from the outside can often be different to what's on the ground. But what is the general feeling with Watford at the moment?
Yeah, you've summed it up quite nicely. I think that when looking from the outside in would say there should be no pressure on Tom Cleverley, and there isn't from the support base. It all comes internally. There's been a period of discontent over the last few weeks where we've built up and up to the point that anyone who was watching the early game against Norwich on Saturday on Sky would have seen and heard some kind of chanting against the owner, and certainly in support of Tom. The reason for this is that there have been kind of reports emanating out of Spain from a guy that's kind of got some stuff right in the past, that Pajeta, who was the Villarreal manager earlier in the season, would be replacing Tom as head coach. In kind of came to the point where the owner put a couple of statements on Twitter, very professional, didn't exactly fill people with confidence, backing Tom. It later emerged that the kind of breakdown over the Pajeta appointment was over a failure to get a work permit. So it feels like Tom's got a bit of a stay of execution, but that he's certainly on thin ice. In terms of the kind of season expectations overall, we're probably punching still at this point, despite that kind of tail off in form, as you alluded to. No one expects us to be anywhere near the playoffs. The fact that we're still within touching distance, even at this stage, is a massive overachievement. So, from a fan point of view, he couldn't be doing a better job with the tool he's got. We'll get in that. But in turn, there's certainly a sense that a change might be coming down the tracks.
And just expand a little bit on Tom Cleverley, if you could, Tom, from an outsider's perspective. Again, looking in, it appears that he's a very bright young manager. I was very impressed with him at Vicarage Road when Sunderland lost 2-1 down there to a late penalty. I thought he spoke about the game very well, as you'd expect from a guy who's come up through Manchester United's academy and played under Sir Alex Ferguson, a wealth of experience. But I thought he seemed like a really, really good guy, a really level-headed guy, and I can see why Watford fans would like that.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's interesting to hear someone that isn't a Watford fan say that, because I think that aligns with what we feel, that good or bad, he comes out and tends to say the things that you would expect. As there's no sugarcoating it when we've been bad, and he's been really quite strong in his words after some games this season, saying things like, that was a team I didn't recognise out there, and kind of calling out the senior players when they've stepped to the plate. He's popular here because he's had such a long association with the club. He first came to Vicarage Road on loan in 2009. We didn't have much money, and there's a kind of apocryphal tale about how Malky Mackay, who was then the manager, had to ring Sir Alex Ferguson up. Mackay in his first managerial role at this point and say, look, there's been a mix-up. We haven't got I think it was 250k that we were on the hook for the loan season. Ferguson, reputation goes before him, but was quite calm about it all and said, just pay us as and when, the sort of thing. Tom went on to be player of the season, came back kind of 8 years later, from boy to man, England international, Premier League winner with United, and played a really important role, often underappreciated as well, I think, that role over the next few years in our best period in our history, really, sustaining Premier League football, reaching an FA Cup final, and being a big part of the team and the captain of the team that went back up to the Premier League after relegation. So he's really popular, and not the best player ever. No one will ever kind of pin him as a proper kind of playing icon or legend, but he's Sorry, did you lose me there? Or
Yeah,
did I just lose you?
I've got you back. I've got you back now, Tom.
I start on the sentence I was previously on. Is that all right? Will you be able
Yeah,
to
yeah,
just,
go for it. I was
yeah.
it was just
Sorry.
in the middle of Tom Cleverley, and I think you just dropped out as you were saying that he'd captained the club through one of its best periods.
Perfect. Yeah, he was captain through promotion to the Premier League, COVID, which was a big achievement and a kind of necessary achievement at that point. So although he wasn't the best player that has ever pulled on a Watford shirt, the point is that he had two very distinct periods in our history where we were kind of uppers, didn't have money to spend, were kind of really fearing what was around the corner, and then the kind of success and the real high of the last few years. But he did it over such a long period of time, and at a time when, as we've already touched upon, the manager changes regularly. There's a high turnover of players. He's been a constant. He's been someone that we can cling to and say he is part of our identity. That's why he's so liked and so well respected. The fact that he's done such a brilliant job this season up to this point obviously only enhances his kind of legend at Watford.
No, absolutely. And talk to me about the Pozzos, if you will. You mentioned a little line there that Watford went through arguably the best period in the history, reached an FA Cup final. There was a long period in the Premier League. They were then relegated, got back to the Premier League. And I think this is the third season now, isn't it, back in the Championship. They've always had a reputation of doing things a little differently, I think, in the football world. And you've alluded to it already with the fan protest and stuff. But talk to us about their arc at Watford, their ownership, and how it all feels like it's coming to a head, despite the fact that in relative terms, they could be viewed as perhaps successful previously at Watford. I think is that fair assumption, Tom?
No, absolutely. The old relationship status, it's complicated. The first year, brilliant. The influx of players that we could never have imagined in our wildest dreams. People that were fantastic for us: Matty Vydra, Fernando Forestieri, Alman Abdi, Aurelio Gomez. They very rarely missed in the kind of transfer market. Got us promoted within a couple of seasons. Even in doing so, we went through 4 coaches in the season we went up, but it was justifiable at that point, that they kind of fell out with one, but another one had health issues. Another one was a very kind of short-term appointment, and it was the fourth guy, Slavica Jokanovic, that got us over the line. Established ourselves in the Premier League, and that's something we've never done in our history, really, in the Premier League era, I should say. Been up a couple of times and been down very quickly. Not the 80s and the original kind of era of success under Graham Taylor. We went all the way to Europe and another cup final. Have we done that? So, for someone like me, I'm in 30. That's the best era of supporting Watford in my life by a long, long shot. You have to then kind of contrast that with the last few years where we've been relegated twice, gone through managers at a now alarming rate that I don't think even the most optimistic kind of positive fan could justify a lot of those changes, and I'm certainly not going to bore you by going through them all, or we'll be here for a long time. But the trend. What's wrong? Sorry, is this my Wi-Fi that's being iffy?
I think potentially, yeah. I think possibly.
Sorry.
It's all right. I've got you back now, so continue on, Tom. We'll get there. Don't worry.
We're reaching kind of end game, and not just for my Wi-Fi here. The feeling is we've got substantial debt now owed to Junior Pozzo donor. We have substantial external debt. We're trying to kind of clear that, and the feeling is, the suspicion is that is all to prime the club for a sale, which is absolutely fine. But the kind of lack of communication flowing out of the club, and the kind of firm denial of having done anything wrong to reach the point where we kind of accrued all this debt and aren't punching towards the Premier League anymore is what kind of irritates supporters. The transfer window has been that in microcosm. You only have to see the last month. We've seen players that didn't work out move on, not be placed, ended weaker. Wish we had ended it stronger than when we went into it. And it all kind of suggests that this season is now going to fizzle out, and leaves people worried about what's to come next season.
Just generally, though, I think I just did a quick count there, and it's 14 or 15 managers since 2014. I'm always interested by that because Sunderland went through a very similar sort of period in their Premier League history where they were going through managers at an alarming rate. I know you have to judge everyone on a case-by-case basis. Some of them may have been justified, others mightn't have. But do you think that's harmed Watford's sort of long-term strategy, that you do need a little bit of stability at times, and when you don't get that, you end up with a squad full of conflicting playing styles and ideas? Has that been sort of a symptom of Watford's fall through the Premier League back to the Championship, and then the failure not to get out of it again? I know Cleverley's been there for a little while now by Watford standards.
No, absolutely right. I think it's a bit of a kind of conflict of interest here, a bit of a contradiction here, in that the model has always been on ownership that the head coach is replaceable. When they first kind of started changing managers at the end of each season, the first season in the Premier League, Quique Sanchez-Flores did really well, but they kind of said at the time, look, we want to aim for higher, we attain for better. Why should we be limited to kind of just surviving as a newly promoted club? And fair enough, that's the sort of thing you probably want to hear as a supporter. We've seen examples of it go both ways, but at the same time, they put a lot of store in the ability of a manager to change things, and we've seen a lot of kind of short, sharp shock appointments. 22-23 season started off with Rob Edwards, brought in Slaven Bilic, ended the season with Chris Wilder, and even though he was only on a contract for kind of 2 or 3 months, they had to come out and say, no, he's not getting sacked. He's not getting sacked, we promise. And that kind of speaks for the environment that it's created over the last 13 years or so. I think a lot of the changes in the first half of that period have been justified. And since then, it's been a case of kind of chucking as much mud at the wall and hoping some of it sticks. They've gone too early on some managers. Javi Gracia got us the FA Cup final. Probably should, if you were being harsh, gone at the end of that season because we were tailing off. But they gave him the start of the next season, some money, spent quite big money for us on Ismaila Sarr and other players, and then kind of pulled the plug on him early. Other managers have probably been allowed to go on too long. So it's really it's the biggest bone of contention, I think, among Watford supporters. And to be honest with you, we're just sick of the fact that that's what people know us for at this stage, really.
No, I can imagine. And how does all this translate to transfers and Watford's transfer strategy? I noticed that Watford had signed Caleb Wiley on loan from Chelsea, who comes very highly rated. I noticed Dan Jebison as well went out. I haven't had a chance to look at Watford's full winter transfer business, but has it made transfers hard? How does that does that work out? And I guess, in terms of this window, are you optimistic given the signings that Watford have made?
It's very apparent that we're shopping in kind of Poundland these days, having kind of dabbled in Waitrose and beyond in recent years. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that if you get the signings right. In the summer, we signed a player called Rocco Vata from Celtic. He was out of contract. We paid kind of 200 grand, give or take. He's brilliant. The likelihood is that he will leave for many multiples of that, and that will be a success, and that will be kind of another, boon for the model of buying cheap and selling high. And that's what they've been very good at. But the feeling is that we also need kind of experienced Championship, and to use the phrase that Tom Cleverley used, oven-ready players to support those younger, talented guys. And that's where we've really, really badly fallen down. The recruitment in the summer was disastrous. You mentioned Dan Jebison came in with high hopes, didn't do very well, certainly didn't endear himself to fans with his activity on social media. Probably for the best for everybody that he got recalled by Bournemouth because 2 of their guys got hurt, Evan Nilsson and Enes Unal, but we've not replaced him. So we go into the game at the Stadium of Light with 2 senior strikers, one of whom's on loan from our sister club Udinese after we sold him to them last summer. He's suspended, so it'll be at best 18-year-old Mamadou Doumbia up front. One of those bought as a prospect, bought as a prodigy, has done very well at kind of youth international level, but he's played kind of 70 minutes in the Championship this season. So I think that kind of underlines in microcosm the issue that there's no one in that kind of experience, ready minutes category. We've got a few kind of older players, and then we've got a lot of younger players that may come good, but you've got to get the right blend, and we just haven't been doing that for a long time. The other thing that irritates Watford fans, and rightly so, is our association with an agent called Mogi Bayat, who Go away and have a Google if you have the chance. He's an interesting character, has kind of been in legal trouble on the continent. A lot of clubs refuse to do business with him. He's in our director's box most games. He's clearly a very close personal friend of the owner, to the point that in the last week we discovered that the owner and he were kind of had been at each other. So had been helping raise money for a charity close to one of them's kind of heart. Despite that, we're told that there's no kind of special relationship there. And look, we get it. Clubs operate with certain agents. We saw it a few years ago, Arsenal and Kia Joorabchian. But I think more often than not, it doesn't end well for the football club. It really, and George says at Wolves, right? Too much influence, arguably. So, and in fact, you had it in recent memory as well, right? There was a guy quite a few years ago at Sunderland, wasn't there? Who was who was it? Was it Roberto De Fanti who kind of got two?
He was actually our director of football, but he ended up director of football equivalent. I can't remember his specific title, but yeah, we ended up with a lot of Italian-based players from the same age, and I can't remember the age, but it was an interesting time.
That's it, exactly. So the fact that when we do have money, that it kind of goes through him leaves a really bad taste in the mouth. Some of his signings have been brilliant. A lot of his signings have been really, really mediocre. So we're in a pretty sticky patch at the moment where there's not money to waste, and we seem to still be wasting it. In terms of this month's business, you mentioned Caleb Wiley. Could be a really good player, and it's against him, but he's not played since the middle of October. He's got a shoulder injury, and we've already been told he's not going to be fit until March to even resume training, by which point most of the season's gone and our season will be over. So entirely pointless. As I say, not replace Jefferson, not address the gaping holes in central midfield. The sporting director, Gianluca Nani, talked ahead of the window about needing to come out of it stronger than you went in. We've completely and utterly done the opposite. And if we hadn't had such a good start to the season, I think we'd be looking over our shoulder a lot more than we all are, which, as pessimistic football fans, we're having a little squint and just, making sure it's in the rearview mirror.
It's interesting that you've also signed a player on loan from a Premier League club who's carried an injury, because Sunderland have done exactly the same. We signed Jayden Dans. We signed him on deadline day, but it got announced the day after deadline day. And it turns out that he's got a back injury, so he's going to go back to Liverpool. Obviously, it probably makes sense to have him for the run-in, just in case there are injuries. But it's not the instant impact signing that most Sunderland fans hoped it would be. So it's heartening actually to know that these things don't just happen to Sunderland, because it can feel like it's just us, doesn't it? When you've got your head down, sort of with your club, you can feel like the world's against you. Can you please talk to me, Tom, about this sister club situation? Because it sounds fantastic on paper. It's very Football Manager-esque, a game of which I have played a lot over the years. You've got a sister club or a feeder club. You swap players. You can get all of these fantastic young Italian wonder kids, and it all works out great, and everybody's happy. But I can imagine the reality is a little bit different of the Pozzos having to devote their sort of resources and time between two different clubs. And I can actually envisage scenarios, which I'm sure has happened over the years, where it's deeply frustrating for Watford fans, perhaps not to feel like they're always the priority.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I think we've done a full 180 on it over the last few years, and actually, it's an unhappy marriage for both parties. I think if you asked Udinese, they would say that we're an issue, and if you ask Watford fans, they'll certainly say Udinese are an issue. What has really exacerbated this is, I mentioned him in the last part, Gianluca Nani is now group technical director, so he kind of splits his responsibilities or his time between us and Udinese. I think you speak to any sporting director, they tell you how busy it is. They're 5 fans, they're never off the phone. So the idea of doing that job for two clubs that have their own kind of needs seems insane to me. We've had the chance to kind of on the pod to question Scott Duxbury about it, and he's adamant that it's an advantage, but I really find that hard to believe. And there's been kind of diminishing returns for us in terms of that relationship. We've signed, as you will have seen from your own research, a lot of players from them in the last 12 months. This month alone, the goalkeeper Egil Selvik came via Udinese, joined them from a Norwegian club at the start of the month, was with us by the end of it. That's a permanent transfer, apparently, so it'll be very interesting to see if money has changed hands there. James Abanqua is on loan with us from Udinese. We sent Antonio Tich out on loan this month. We only found out we signed him permanently this month. because we all thought he was on loan from Udinese from last summer. He's a player that Tom Cleverley didn't want. They tried to foist upon Valerian Ismail this time last year, failed, brought him in over the summer. He's played in the League Cup only because he's so below the kind of level. But we signed him permanently last summer, apparently, found out this month, and now he's out on loan in Austria. Make of that what you will. And it kind of goes on and on in that vein. The one that possibly would have caught on what the fans' eyes in recent years is the signing of Hassan Kamara. We bought him in when we were in the Premier League a couple of years ago for about £4 million. Did very well, was player of the season despite being here for half a season, which kind of sums up the rest of the team's efforts that year. Sold Udinese that summer for 16 million, 27 years old, loaned back to us immediately. Club said there was nothing in it. I find that very hard to believe. And yet, much like the relationship with the Pozzos as a whole, the first kind of half of this era was quite good, and we were certainly the beneficiaries. I mentioned some of the guys at the top, Vidra, Forestieri, Alman Abdi, all came from Udinese, were all brilliant, were all far in excess of the kind of players that we'd seen at this level in Watford shirts prior. There was another club, Granada in Spain. They're also part of this kind of Pozzo family and network. We got players from them, Daniel Pudel, a Czech international, Akechi Anya, who went on to play for Scotland. They both came via Granada. So we have benefited. It's not to pretend we haven't. It just feels like at the moment there's been a very clear shift, and the Udinese are the chief beneficiaries here. They are the club that the Pozzo family has owned since the 80s and kind of dragged up from being quite a small provincial club to getting into Europe regularly. You may Football Manager fan as well. Probably remember the likes of Alexis Sanchez, Arturo Vidal.
Di Natale was the one. Remember Di Natale?
That's it. Exactly. All came through their stable, and we've kind of benefited from that, as I say. But I think the balance has shifted very much towards Udinese at the moment, which is understandable. But we are still here. We are still here, and it does feel like we're rather neglected in this relationship.
No, absolutely. You mentioned Caleb Wiley's not going to be fit for the Sunderland game at the stadium. Like, what other injury news is there from the Watford camp? How are Tom Cleverley's side shaping up?
Yeah, we're struggling at the moment, to be honest with you. The reason we signed the goalkeeper is our first choice, Daniel Bachmann, is out for the bulk of the rest of the season. Midfielder Pierre Duomo hasn't played a lot, probably would have played more because our midfield is light. He's got a thigh injury that'll keep him out for a couple of months. The real big one is Kwadwo Bar, who may not have been kind of quite in the team at the time that Sunderland came to Vicarage Road, but has really kind of come on leaps and bounds since then. Explosive. He's got a bad injury as well, so his season isn't quite over, but he's going to miss a good chunk of the rest of it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Vacan Bayo, who divisive figure, our top scorer and one of the Championship's top scorers, but he's only scored in 7 games this season. He's serving a 3-match ban. Probably one of the players that may come in for him is Rocco Vata, who I mentioned earlier. He's not a striker, but I think it's unlikely Cleverley's going to throw Amadou Mbia in there for his first stop, up at a team that's flying high, tough game. Rocco Vata might be the one to come in. He missed out last weekend against kind of expectations with the Eagles, so hopefully he will be fit. If it's not him, then I honestly do not know what we're going to do up front, because there is nobody else. It's slightly concerned.
And given all that, given the injuries, given the noise, the general state of Watford post-transfer window, how do you envisage the game going? Obviously, Sunderland are in decent form, but they've shown that they're not adverse to a bad result at home. They haven't actually lost at home this season. So it did slip up last time against Plymouth Argyle, the bottom club in the Championship. Laboured to a 2-2 draw, arguably could have lost that game as well. So I feel that although Sunderland are obviously in good form, 3 points off the top 2 places, everyone's fairly happy at the moment. I do think there's something there that can be got. I don't think Sunderland are infallible at the moment, and that makes for an interesting game, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's as I said on our pod this week, you've not lost at home this season, which is a pretty remarkable record. We had a similar good record until recently. That's out the window now, unfortunately. I think the way we are going, this is probably one of the worst possible fixtures we could have on the horizon, to be honest with you. As you mentioned, our form has been poor. Away, we have been particularly poor. We've only won 3 away games this season. Just had to check that. Millwall on the opening day, thrashed Sheffield Wednesday 6-2 in a freak game, and won at a poor Derby side a few weeks ago. Generally on the road, we are poor. We're really struggling to create chances at the moment. Our first shot on target against Norwich on Saturday came in the 72nd minute. We had next year of kind of 0.7. And we're not particularly strong at the back either. You know, we tend to concede early. We tend to concede the first goal and make it hard for ourselves. One thing I would say is I know that you don't score heaps of goals at home, despite that imperious home record. You're not one of the kind of higher scorers at home, top scorers at home. That defensive record is very strong as well. So it's going to be a really tough game. We've often skated by. Actually, the home game against Sunderland was a prime example of this, by kind of scoring late goals or bringing somebody off the bench who will change the game. I'm just trying to refresh my memory. I'm pretty sure, actually, having mentioned him earlier, that it was Kwadwo Bar who had an impact in the home game, who won the penalty that we scored kind of with 5 minutes to go. He's injured. It's going to put a lot of pressure, a lot of onus on Rocco Vata and Georgie Chakvatadze to be the ones that are going to change it. I suspect Tom go there with intention of being solid and trying to create a platform from which to nick something. I think we'd all take a point right now.
I think it's an interesting game, actually, obviously because of where Sunderland are in the league and everything Watford have going on and the narrative around them. But that game at Vicarage Road earlier on in the season, Dan Neil, who was Sunderland's homegrown captain, 23 at the time, has since turned 24. He gave away that penalty. Obviously, fans, as they are on social media, a lot of fans got behind him. A lot of fans criticised him, and possibly rightly so, because he cost Sunderland the game. But there were questions about his captaincy. That's since died down. I spoke to him after the Middlesbrough game. And we mentioned that Watford moment and him maybe calming down and just trying to relax into his sort of new leadership role. But what struck me is that Watford game is still very much in their minds, and obviously players like to get motivated, and it was something that I got the impression that they would quite like to put right, which is again another narrative. I actually thought Watford were very good at Vicarage Road that day, and probably just edged the game. I thought, the Vicarage Road crowd was excellent and potentially played a part. I never really thought Sunderland were going to go on and win the game. Perhaps a point would have been a fair result. But again, it's interesting coming into it.
Yeah, I don't find any issue in take any issue with anything you've said there. I worry about us going up there. We are really thin. I think it's kind of 17 fit outfield players at the moment, and a lot of those aren't in great nick. The one thing that kind of gives me a bit of confidence and a bit of, I guess, intrigue as much as anything is, I mentioned him earlier, James Abankwa, who's come in, has started really well at centre half, had a good partnership with Matty Pollock last weekend. It's been one game, so don't read too much into it. I think the likelihood is we'll have Egil Selvik in goal for the first time. He's got some quite good goal prevention numbers from his time in Norway. How well does that translate? We'll see. But I think it's going to be a case of just going there, parking the bus a little bit and seeing what we can do. The problem with that is, obviously, as soon as you concede, and we probably will, you have to change what your plan is entirely, and it kind of, throws everything out. It's interesting that you mentioned that for Sunderland, that coming to Vicarage Road was one of the kind of, holds significance for you in this season. Last season, going up to the Stadium of Light, we were well beaten 3-0 midweek. Barely got a kick. That was kind of the real turning point for us under Valerian Ismail. They kind of backed him with a new contract, and we went on a decent run and got ourselves into playoff contention in time for the new year. Didn't capitalise in the January transfer window, fell away, and he got the sack to be replaced by Tom Cleverley. I hope that our next trip to Sunderland doesn't bear the hallmarks of that game.
And what's your prediction, just finally, Tom? How do you think you'll feel come the end of the game?
I will feel. I think we'll probably lose. I'm going to say 3-1. My father-in-law is a Newcastle fan. A lot of my family are Newcastle fans. I used to live in Sunderland as I went to the university, so I will feel conflicted, because I hope if Watford aren't to do well this season, then it will be Sunderland.
I feel like your popularity's just dipped.
I should have said that earlier, shouldn't I?
Yeah, it's your popularity's just dipped and then spiked back up in the same.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, Tom.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it, and hopefully we can get you on the next time Sunderland play Watford. Hopefully, from our point of view, it might not be for a couple of seasons if we get promoted.
Yes, absolutely right. No, would love to. Thank you very much for being on.
Brilliant. Thank you to everybody for joining us for this preview podcast. You can find all of the latest Sunderland content, including news ahead of Sunderland's clash against Watford at the Stadium of Light, over at the Sunderland Echo website. Thanks once again for listening.